Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, modern European philosophy, and Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza, the often credited as the second major modern European philosopher after Descartes. I have stuck Spinoza in the Germanics, which is an odd place to put him, but that's the nearest place I can put him. Technically, he's not Spanish, he is Jewish, but he's in Amsterdam, and I'm putting that with the Germanics, yes, because of language families in the tabs. So my apologies about that, but he is, of course, solidly in the modern European canon. He is, in a sense, along with oftentimes, in fact, Hobbes is considered the second modern European philosopher, but he is a social and political philosopher, much. So oftentimes, if you are taking a class like 20B, you may or may not have Hobbes, but you certainly would have Descartes and then Spinoza. Many of these thinkers, they are thinkers who think about objective and subjective truth, to put it simply, as well as many other interrelated things. And then they also think about ethics, politics, what have you. I will mention, Locke is involved in politics. He does checks and balances before America. And then we have people like Mill are involved in ethics, and so is Kant. But we are, in this class, in 20B, sticking to epistemology and ontology. Essentially, what is and how do we know all of that? So we are talking about objective and subjective truth, how truth and meaning work very much. We leave the ethics and the politics somewhat to other more specialized philosophy classes. That is how I cut up my classes, and it makes the sense decently with the state and much of the country. As much as it does. So Spinoza lived from 1632 to 1677. He was born in the Portuguese Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam, and was thus Jewish, Portuguese, and Dutch. Jews had fled from Spain and Portugal, to nearby lands during the Spanish Inquisition of 1492, and the Portuguese Inquisition of 1536, 40 years later. If 1492 is a familiar date, I do like to go on a bit about 1492. It is the year that the Christians retook Spain from Muslims. And also, coincidentally, the year Columbus chose to leave Spain and sail as far across the world as he could. Now, he was trying to get to India for the Portuguese and Spanish, etc., but he chose to leave Spain and sail as far across right as the folks took back over. He not only had access to Islamic-type ships, cartography, and other things like that, as the Christians took over Spain and Portugal again, but while Jews thrived in Spain and Portugal under Islamic rule, and plenty of types of Christians, sometimes occupying high places in government, education, science, and medicine, the Catholic Portuguese Inquisition that actually caused Spinoza's own Jewish community to flee Amsterdam. Again, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition unless you're actually fleeing from the second, the Portuguese, and your Spinoza's family, because they may have fled both. The Spinoza's family fled to the Portuguese Catholic Inquisition to Amsterdam, and that happened 100 years before his birth. And some scholars say that the Portuguese Spinoza family was originally the Spanish Espinosa family. Of course, Espinosa is a, common Spanish name. And some of whom fled to Portugal to avoid the Spanish Inquisition. Some fled, while others remained in Spain and converted to Catholicism. If this is true, Spinoza's branch of the family successfully fled both Inquisitions and may or may not, be somewhat Christian, somewhat Jewish, somewhat Islamic. Depending. So Spinoza was not only a philosopher, but also a scientist, a mathematician, and a biblical scholar, studying the Bible critically to understand and interpret its authorship, meaning, and historical context. Spinoza's views of the Bible and its authorship, radical for the time, got him kicked out of the Jewish community of Amsterdam at the age of 23, as well as ostracized by the surrounding Christian community. Like Descartes, his work was put on the Catholic Index of Forbidden Books. I did work on Eriugena back in the day. He was doing things around the year 900. He was also put on that prohibited index. That was trying to say, that's early European scholarship. Many are like, before science. No, that was back when they had so few books. They were trying to keep the good ones away from the bad ones, apparently. There are far too many books for that. Somewhat. So, Spinoza was once attacked as he left the synagogue by a man with a knife who yelled out heretic, and Spinoza then wore the cloak with a tear from the knife, a knife tear, for years afterwards as a badge of honor. Spinoza was one of the first European biblical scholars on record to question the traditional understanding. He was in a place he could question more. His family fled there. One of the first to question openly that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, for the Jews the Torah, the only Testament, were not written by Moses. This is, again, I've been doing a lot of the Monty Python bit. It's like, and it's like, it doesn't say, and it's like, no, actually it says, and that may be a slight illusion, that it has become standard for scholarship to not credit the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses' authorship, possibly because he dies in them, And again, it talks about him in the third person. So it as Moses did this, Moses did that. Did he talk about himself that way? Was it changed? But it was just given sort of, Moses wrote these things down. It doesn't actually technically say that entirely, but he wrote those down and then he gave those, and that makes it nice and official and authoritative. It's just, it sort of contradicts things in the text. At the time, they were still known as the 5 books of Moses, until Spinoza and others pointed this out. That Exodus speaks about Moses in the third person. Moses dies near the end, making his authorship of the books quite questionable. Islamic scholars had noted this problem centuries earlier, and worked that over their own ways. After being banished from Amsterdam for a brief period and then returning, Spinoza lived as a lens grinder. He was on that grind, children, making lenses for telescopes and microscopes. Muslims and the Europeans were seeing more through lenses, and then seeing those things, they noticed things on the moon, things in the blood, etc. He turned down several teaching positions for a quiet and private life. Because he died at the relatively young age of 44 from an unknown lung condition, it is suspected that Spinoza's death was in part due to the fact that he ground glass for a living, and he likely inhaled glass powder enough that it slowly helped kill him. He was known as an outstanding producer of lenses. And these, maybe he had them in about an hour, probably took longer. And these were used by scientists in the field of optics, astronomy, and medicine during the European Enlightenment, as they had been in earlier forms by Muslims. After his writing several works on science, theology, and philosophy, particularly criticism of Descartes, which would put you in a good place to then write further work, wouldn't it? Spinoza wrote his masterpiece, The Ethics, which was only published after his death and written in Latin, as was most European scholarship for centuries. You would just write in Latin. It only became common to write in German or English later. And again, these are fewer books. Less was put into print, and confidently so. And much was plagiarized, and that was more sticking to what was officially text that was okay. If all this, of course, does seem rather, scary to think of how effective texts are and how people had them far fewer and just were getting used to printing. Plenty. Again, the Chinese invented printing 1,000 years ago. 500 years ago, the Bible was printed, and that was one of the only books out there. So think about how that affected people and what people would think texts would do. And now we text each other. Again, text your mother. You never call. You never scribe. Ancient Egyptian mother routine. Again. So it was published after his death and written in Latin. He didn't actually get to publish his masterpiece, The Ethics, in his life, and that made it safe for him to not, maybe they kicked his corpse a while, It's criticism, biblical. The Leibniz, we're going to examine next, visited Spinoza and discussed his as-yet unpublished ethics with him. Then, after returning to Germany, Leibniz plagiarized parts of the work and published them interspersed with his own without giving Spinoza credit. There are many instances in philosophy, both ancient and modern, of duplicated work that dances on the boundary between illegitimate plagiarism and legitimate influence. Philosophers often fail to mention names when using ideas in the sequence of an argument. Of course, it is interesting to stop and think, where did I get those ideas? And of course, sometimes we pull them from places we know, and other times we remember, oh wait, that's where I pulled that idea from. I tell lots of jokes. I have lots of ideas and silly things, some good, occasionally. Occasionally I have nice cats. Yes, they wander through. there was one. He has disappeared. But of course, with all that, then sometimes I will think, I'll see something I haven't seen in years. I'm like, I think I picked up a bit of a joke from that right there, didn't I? And I forgot. And of course, people were like that more with text back in the day. So, although Spinoza was interested in investigation and observation of the sciences, he was drawn to rationalism via philosophy and mathematics. His ethics is an attempt to do philosophy as a formal Euclidean geometric proof. Euclid, now this is odd, he calls it the ethics. It's actually he tries to make it a very mathematical word problem, perfect philosophy that works like clockwork. He calls it the ethics, and it is largely about how all things are actually one, which is sort of an ethical thing, but he means in much in the beginning, epistemologically, how we figure things out. So it's not very clear. And these are earlier words, but it is very strange. It makes sense because ultimately he is saying all is God and we are God, and it makes a bunch of sense. And that is ethical in a sense. But that isn't much of I already mentioned I'm not covering Hobbes because he's a political thinker. This is not really ethical thought that we're covering. It's nice thought. It's not going to push your grandmother into traffic, unnecessarily. And again, unless she has on the proper gear, she has the right kind of insurance, and she's asking you for it. So, I mean, nicely. This is ethics in that I guess he is calling his math of the world and the cosmos ethics, is basically what makes sense here. So he is trying to talk things out like Euclid. Before algebra, it's good to say here, he has a very odd philosophy that's hard to read. That is because he's actually trying to do word problem philosophy like math and make it perfect. And remember, before algebra, people actually talked word problem math out. I have been thinking in logic of Georgia peasants. You say 5 plus 7, what is it? They're like, well, do I have a wheelbarrow? Is it cats? What is it? And if you try to get them to reason beyond that, they're like, no, I need to know what it is. You and I have a lot of experience, or maybe you don't, I do, in math classes getting graded on whether or not you fill out a bunch of symbols correctly, which people would not necessarily know how to do or why that's important. We don't anymore either, but technically, if you get a bunch of grades, you're supposed to go on and then kind of get a degree, and then that's all vague, but it all fills itself in. Back in the day, it wouldn't have been clear, again, what's math, what's ethics, all so much as specialized. It still was, but it also is that algebra, we practice equations. We have things like Islamic algebra symbolic equations. Think about when they did not, and you would have talked math out, and this is how the Greeks did it. They didn't have algebra or equations. They would sit there and say, so, if I have this many of this, and then I'm going over here, and then I do that many of that, how large is the triangle in squares of units, not just quantitative numbers, but like how many squares fit into the triangle, and then they would proceed to reason. Now, they are doing something plenty like equational reasoning, but the equations actually give it a kind of structure that this does not have, and then he is trying, it's almost like he is trying to do philosophy as ethics in formal logic, but there isn't formal logic that's algebraic yet. That has to be that's Boole, Frege, and others I'm going to discuss in logic with the logic class. So he's actually doing ethics. It looks like word problem math. It doesn't look like ethics. And then he's trying to talk out where the world and our minds very much come from the very beginning, which isn't really ethics. It's more like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, but it is different. So he sets forward a lot of axioms, things that he is going to try to work with, and many experts have pored over it and they cannot make entire sense of it. Now, like Descartes' arguments, which I actually flew a little quickly over last time, I realized I was treading on the hour, and I realized, okay, I'm going to, and I do stand by, Descartes says, well, then God and math is real. He doesn't do a great job proving it. That leads to others like Spinoza. And that is like Descartes in 20 seconds, or less right there. Spinoza has moves that we're not going to cover precisely. And in fact, I don't remember people I covered Spinoza in college as an undergrad myself. It was covered sort of briefly, and it's like, yeah, look that over. Okay, then. So don't drive yourself nuts reading the text. I have links to the free text online for the students and for anyone to study. But experts pore over all this and they can't make much sense of it. So again, like with Descartes and like with intro lectures, you can spend hopefully a lifetime studying this or that text, and hopefully more than this or that text. But we're going to cover the briefest outline here in this lecture of Spinoza There will be a bit, likely less, I can go on a tear, than Descartes, and then we are going to do another shorter lecture about Leibniz. Then we will be able to move on to Locke, Hume, and others. I'm going to try to knock out a couple of these lectures here over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday. Doesn't sound like there's any construction today, so we're going to get some of this done. So while Euclid did not use equations, he tried to work systematically in a way that mathematical and logical proofs work, and Spinoza attempted to follow Euclid's method to make his thinking rigorous and sound. Rigorous meaning it is careful all the way throughout it, and sound meaning everything is true, and then the conclusion is true and must be, as firmly as possible. This is why he is known as a rationalist. He is trying to make it all mathematical and deductive very much. The empiricists, as I already mentioned, they're going to try to actually gather up a bunch inductively and say, well, we can't have purely deductive principles. It goes back and forth with that thinker. We'll get into detail later. But we inductively learn about swans and geese. We don't deduce principles so much. We do, but only after learning things inductively. All these people are pro-science. The rationalists believe in coming up with principles from science. The empiricists, though, lean on the side that it's not really boiled into principles, it's more constant induction and reevaluation. I am somebody who thinks that that's more the way the sciences are thought of now and practiced now, but in fact these debates rage on. Probably not because of anything about science or what have you, because dogmatism and skepticism, something like more objective-ish, subjective-ish views, you can actually see in all sorts of movements and systems of thought. And don't get too angry at them. They are back and forth ways we try to solve problems, and that here's the dominant answer, well, here's alternate answers, and all that seems to be the way history wrestles out more perspective in our individual minds as well as socially. I have not detailed this all out. I will get to Hegel and then Nietzsche and later thinkers, and when we get to postmodernism, we will already have a lot of these ideas through Descartes and Spinoza rolled into what I am kind of talking about, which is we have not gotten to Hegel and dogmatism and skepticism. But the rationalists by Hegel are seen as more dogmatic. They want objective truth. Spinoza, like Descartes, likes math. He is going to try to prove principles and then deduce mathematical-like answers. Hegel says, but along comes the skeptics, who are more so the empiricists. They say, but science doesn't come up with principles of geese and math as much as it comes up with something like we learn through practice. That actually will take us through Kant onward to Wittgenstein, which I like, and postmodernism and all of that. So, but unlike Descartes, his fellow rationalist here, in trying to work out a mathematical proof of everything, Spinoza argues that our reality and world is indivisibly one and the same as God. Now, this is very heretical, published after his death. Spinoza is very much known as a pantheist, which means he very weirdly, and there's a couple of Leibnizes, even stranger, but he's not a pantheist, Leibniz. In fact, deliberately not, in ways I will not mention here. It'll be clear when we get there. Spinoza actually believes, as I knock on the table, everything is God. So like, I'm God, you're God, this is God. And it's like this is all just the mind of God equally. It's all just God. Now, technically, that's a heretical position, as I'll get into. And it's interesting the psychology why, but it makes total simple sense. And again, I never want to step on anybody's toes, but I love the history of religion and philosophy. And so I want to share the positions with you, which is the position of the Catholic Church is not exactly Descartes and not exactly Spinoza's, and it's very much not Spinoza's. Descartes, again, may or may not have gotten killed and offed with the poison wafer, right? The a la communion, but ain't so communal. In this case, if it was, probably a Protestant lie, well, half lie. I was half Catholic, half Catholic, kind of pragmatic. That yes, if I'm cafeteria half Catholic, then it may be a half truth. Yes, because it's half Protestant. Well, fully Protestant, perhaps half true. Again, I get mixed up with these things. But in the Anglophonic world, again, as I toy around with ideas of various type of cultures that are all too personal, and were very personal, and I guess personally attacked Spinoza. I feel personally attacked as a Spanish, Portuguese, Jewish person in Amsterdam in the 1600s, as Spinoza speaking so. Central to the work, Spinoza attacks Cartesian dualism. So if you think all is God, that's not Descartes' dualism. Now, technically, what the Catholic Church says is you're under them, they are not God, and then God is above all of us. Now, that's very splitty dualistic, isn't it? There's higher and then there's lower. Well, Spinoza's like, no, it's just all in the same and we're all that and that's math. He sounds like Mutazilites of Islam. This is all just rational math and that's all God and this is all mind. Well, that's really groovy. But the problem is that the Catholic Church, as I actually say with a bit with Descartes, they officially do not believe with the Gnostics that this world is ruled by Satan. As they were, early Christianity is a bit Gnostic, and you can hear that in the early texts. It's like, well, the Romans and the others are controlling us. We need to break through. But as I mentioned, once, in fact, Cyrus took over from Nebuchadnezzar, a lot of Jews stayed, and they stopped so much trying to chant down Babylon a la Rastafarianism. And in a similar way, with all of this kind of stuff, it's the Gnosticism actually turned into God's officially separate from the world, above the world, is not the world, is the simplest way of saying it. Pantheism is actually attacked. Nature worship, witches, sometimes environmentalists, sometimes are actually attacked by more conservative Christians as actually being pantheistic, therefore being possibly in league with Satan, as I will get to. Because technically, and you can believe whatever you like, and if you want to believe both, then there's panentheism, which is kind of sort of the Catholic position, the sort of, it's like God's anywhere he wants to be, but kind of superior and outside, which is kind of what that is. You can see, actually, the dueling states of psychology, the dueling mind states. Here I offer you that. I can't, again, prove these simply are and aren't real. I do like to point out all the angles, though, yes? So Spinoza actually is attacking dualism. Now, Descartes says body and mind. Now, notice God and the world. Now, Spinoza attacks body and mind. They're one and the same. This is all mind. I'm all mind of God. So that actually means the world and us and God are all just the same mind, and it's just one level of that. And God just thinks as all of us or something like that as his thoughts. Now, that's not unprecedented in Neoplatonism and medieval history of thought. It's not. But making it radically monistic and then actually making it mathematical. Think about it. Then you're also, as a rationalist, saying it's sort of discretely chopped into bits mathematical. All of that is very strange and interesting, and this is a historical point of view. I don't try to perfectly make any of these philosophers make sense as much as, of course, I present their views most favorably, and then I like to share the amusing details of their lives. That part's weird and interesting, especially over the centuries. But, of course, what we do is we share the strengths and the faults, and I let you think for yourself. So it is important for me to tell you that whether or not you think this, just everything around you is just equally God and God's capable of that, or you believe in God's, not God's, whatever you do. And in fact, if you believe the world's rational and mathematical, and if you're a hard atheist, talk about that. All I mean is don't have more or less beliefs or anything, There's interesting ways where all of this is trying to fit out where is the reasoning and the math in the world, and how is the world mathematical? Well, for Spinoza, the world's mathematical because here's the mind of God as algebra right here. Again, the Mutazilites of Islam were hard rationalists, and they say God cannot contradict God's self, which not everybody in Islam agrees with them. That sounds like you're trying to tell God, and they're like, no, it's just God's perfect reason. It was like that when we got here. We didn't tell anybody what to do. So God just adds up like math everywhere. But they may not have been as hard pantheists as Spinoza, but you can see how that allows for pantheism, because then this is all rational and alive and conscious as math of God in the math all around you, which is interesting and weird. You can see how that solves the problem. Descartes, again, says spirit is some nebulous thing. We have free will, which is nebulous, and then it pokes the marionette that is our body some imaginary way. He really doesn't. Leibniz is like, it has to be separate. It can't touch. Descartes kind of is like, it sort of gets in there somehow. He's a dualist. How can it? It can't. But basically, yeah, we're sort of marionettes controlled by spirit, and then this is mechanical body, dead zombie, robot land down here. Only if it's spirit is it conscious. And again, he does not think animals are conscious. For Spinoza, notice he flips that completely around. While being a mathematical rationalist, he deduces, in fact, that actually this has to be one and the same as God, and we're all just God, and this is all just the process of that, which is completely opposite Descartes' dualism. Notice, in some ways, putting something as authority above you makes it awesome. In other ways, putting it equally as you makes it awesome. And they're actually trying to find how God and math reason all of that in a Europe that's increasingly becoming technological and enabled, is capable of doing all of this. And they're like, well, it's mind of God this way and that way. Russell much later is going to say it's math and logic, and he actually is a staunch atheist. So he talks a lot like these ways. More like Descartes. But again, as I'll mention, a lot of then later atheistic thinking will talk exactly the same ways. It's about science or math, not God and math. And I encourage my students not to, be offended or gleefully happy at people's mistakes either way. I just suggest, what does all that mean for your and my psychology, and all of that. Yes. So each individual thing, it is useful, and I remember getting into arguments actually in dorm rooms back in the day because I had early philosophy classes, and as a philosophy student, it's important you not shut up at any point. That way you soak the whole world in. Again, each individual thing, including minds, are something like a wave, and Spinoza does use this image, that it's like a wave on the sea. If you think that you can clearly look at the sea and see waves, the waves are the sea, but they're not the sea. This is a metaphor you find in other cultures, but Spinoza here uses it to say this is all the sea, this is all being, this is all mind. You and I are bumps on being. We stand out as what we are because we're consciousness standing out from the bigger consciousness, and then we sort of fall back into the ocean somewhat. And he has particular views about that, actually, which oddly are like an episode of The Simpsons, as I will mention. So according to Spinoza, nature, the world, and all of being is just God, just brute equal that. It skips out on the panentheism or theism, like the problems there. It's a pantheistic position. It infuriates somewhat the traditionally religious, did in his day. That's where the knife, Toro, the bull. And he twists and turns and shouts, he's from Spain, possibly from Spain originally, before Portugal. So, just as the Gnostic notion of a world ruled by Satan, again, was removing God from the world somewhat entirely too much for the church because they want the authority of God along with them in the world, not just Gnostic, this is Satan, because that makes the church look like they are agents of Satan, do Protestants and then not Protestants, once the Protestants have enough authority, and all that. It is interesting the way the world turns, yes, and the world turns. This is somewhat heretical to Orthodox back again, According to the Jewish and Christian Orthodox position, again, it is that God's sort of identical with, but created the world and is superior and original to it. And that actually is somewhat in Genesis right there, because it's then created the water. It's over the waters, weirdly, which may be what Spinoza's thinking specifically, is the waters, and then we're all still the waters. But firmament comes out of it, and then it's, in the same, so anyway, God doesn't talk to himself and then his firmament. Let's keep going. In the same vein, right-wing evangelical Christians, again, have sometimes taken to attacking the environmental movement. I come from hippie land. I'll just, not get into all of this. Is that it's somewhat say, but you can hear there was a DVD I found called The Green Dragon. And again, I'm not trying to, attack or support particular products, But yeah, it basically is all I know is from reading the blurb about it online. It is basically hippies are in league with Satan, and this is pantheism. Because when you try to hug trees and the trees don't hug you back, I've tried. I'm telling you. Basically that is in league with Satan because it's worshiping God as just nature directly, and that's actually Satan, but that's not Gnosticism because actually, yes. So yeah, it does make sense in its ways. We're not going to stay with all of that. I am fascinated with the psychology and logic of all different sorts of systems, including religious, spirituality, all of that. And again, I am just interested, not making recommendations here. Spinoza argued against the immortality of the soul, which helped to label him a heretic. Like Jains and Buddhists of India, Spinoza believed that the self ceases to be a separate individual thing at death, but you still get sort of an immortality, which again appears on an episode of The Simpsons, oddly, or sort of like it. I was watching a lot of Simpsons back in the day, again, while taking college classes and such, as well as South Park and other shows. So, in a certain sense, what Spinoza actually says, and it's possible that Isaac Newton believed something like this around the same time. It's iffy, but this is the best guess according to experts that I have read. Spinoza did not argue for stages of reincarnation or that you get released back into the cosmos. For Jains and Buddhists, you actually are sort of the cosmic consciousness, but then you get to go back to it just as it, and your individuality is somewhat dissolved into the whole. The Hindus actually believe more like Christians. They believe in reincarnation, unlike traditional Christians today, many of them, but they also believe that yourself is enduring, so you keep your individual soul no matter how much you go through in reincarnation. For the Jains and Buddhists, you actually have an enduring soul that can go through reincarnation, but actually it then can get dissipated back into and elevated into states of enlightenment where it's more merged, one and the same as the cosmos. That gets into a lot of interesting back and forths about Indian thought we're not getting into. But it does seem like in certain ways, some of these thinkers, including Newton and possibly Spinoza, Don't think that if you do math or science, you are actually becoming part of the structure of the whole, and that part of you, almost like the Pythagorean Y I mentioned with Pythagoras. I have those notes and lectures up online, actually. That what you're actually doing is the part of you that's most steady and stable stays, which means in a certain sense, if you learn about science with Isaac Newton and Spinoza or something and do math, that part of you becomes the mathematics of the world, and that part kind of gets to stay, and the rest of you sort of melts back into the whole. I don't claim, again, how to track all of this, of course, but that seems to be what's going on, is that actually you can gain the eternal afterlife, but it is kind of Buddhistic. It's because what you gain as part of the universal, as part of yourself, then you are. It weirdly, and the monism and the pantheism actually does fit kind of in Indian's form decently. It's odd because, again, while the Portuguese are plenty, were then in India, there's not a great deal of reason to believe, as far as I know, that Spinoza was influenced by Indian thought. If there was, I would actually be jumping up and down all over it, because that is the kind of connection. If somebody's come out with, with an article or two since then, I will be a bit upset with myself. Again, even if I am undivided from myself, God, and the world, because, of course, somehow we have come apart here at the seams. And I am not aware that how Spinoza is influenced by Indian thought, but he's very like it, nonetheless, strangely. So in an episode of The Simpsons, Bart sells his soul. It's a very famous episode of the Golden Age of The Simpsons. The Golden Ages, seasons, yes. But then he regrets the decision, and he spends a day and a night tracking it down. And his sister Lisa says at the very end, in the last lines of the episode, she tells him some philosophers, and she uses the word philosophers, and of course she's sort of the intellectual kid of the clan, that some philosophers believe one is not born with a soul, but earns one, as he did. And that is sort of like Pythagoras and sort of like Spinoza. The part of you that's good stays, and it's sort of implied because that's maybe your individual self or soul, but it actually, for Spinoza, Pythagoras is a little less clear here, although some may claim it is far clearer, because people are opinionated, and much love and happiness in being so. But for Spinoza, you're actually much more like a Buddhist ultimate. You're at a higher level, and you are getting back I'm going to much more merge into it and lose my individuality. That actually, it is much more that the part of you actually that would be an individual here, you would become math very much like the cosmos insofar as you study theology and math for Spinoza. And insofar as you don't study math and theology and make mathematical sense of theology, which is what he's trying to do in physics, that part of you simply, and pleasantly and whatever, just simply does not exist anymore. So obviously, if you want to be part and eternal, although you won't know who you are probably, then study, you know what I mean? And that actually is the route of knowledge for Indian philosophy, where you can meditate, you can do hardcore practices, and you can do God worship, but you can also study and do philosophy. That seems to be what Spinoza is saying. You actually gain a soul through doing philosophy and science and theology, through being rational, through being a rationalist. That actually seems to be what he is recommending, although even though he printed this after his death, he still doesn't say everything you would not say at that time, and maybe does not say things he would want to say that would clarify these things and leaves it a bit cryptic. Because all things are God, all things are also eternal, but not as individual things that remain unchanging. Spinoza seems to say that insofar as our minds contemplate the true ways of things, our minds become the ways of things, and are thus as eternal as the ways we contemplate. This is much like saying that by studying the gravitational constant, you become the gravitational constant, and are thus enduring as the constancy of gravity, and constancy itself, which is mathematics itself, of course, in its ways. Enduring as long as it endures. Perhaps if someone wants an eternal afterlife, reminding them that energy can't be created or destroyed would hopefully make them happy, perhaps not all of them, though. Spinoza believed that reality is one substance with all particular beings linked together by chains of causation. Spinoza was a determinist, and he believed that there was no real freedom or chance in the universe. Now, it's possible to have chaos in here and then say, well, it's all chaotic. Who really knows? God remains open and free, and you are open and free as God in chaos. It's totally possible to have such a position. But Spinoza thinks this all works like a rational clock, even though weirdly it doesn't come of discrete pieces. Again, of course, Descartes would, because everything's broken up into discrete chunks, completely separate parts. But for Spinoza, like Anaxagoras, no two things are completely split with an axe, as Anaxagoras said. And so of ancient Greece. So is for Spinoza, he believes that this does work like a pinball machine, and you should be able to deduce, if you could, or if you are God, you would know exactly what's going to happen. That is very like the Mutazilites. Islam also can be a bit on the, not always, but a bit on the deterministic side, that God already knows as science math, so you cannot, we can. There are, Calvinism is a bit like this. Again, it gets into different sorts of types of Protestantism and other things. I believe that, the Scots are Presbyterian, which is even more fun, on the weekend, is that, yes, basically, much love and happiness, is my grandfather, again, was a bit Presbyterian. A little more so than that. The will and mind is not the personal care of an emotional being with a personality, though this sort of suggests. It's the causal workings and design of nature, and that's sort of the best part of us, so it doesn't really hug you that much, or, again, I can't, and Spinoza doesn't say. Reason reveals the necessary causal connections between things, so they're necessary. We see the math, and then it has to be that math insofar as we see the necessity. Spinoza argues that human beings, like Descartes, believe in free will because they are aware of desires but do not understand the reasons behind them. So whenever we think there's freedom, that's mere ignorance. Now, if you're a hard determinist, that's a good line to have. Any amount of chaos that you see is not chaos, it's just our ignorance of the determined. Now, I actually think the world's a bit fair and not fair, and I'm a bit skeptical, and I like the skepticism some and some not, so I don't know how, and I do think projecting order into the world, and remember, human order, into the world, and math into the world, may be a bit hardlining. So again, I don't think that we necessarily can follow this, but I was actually decently more so the determinist until I came to my position today. And I actually did like Spinoza, and I did think that, well, if you could see everything that happens, why wouldn't you know exactly the outcome? Now I actually think that that's not necessarily true, but things like arguments between determinism and free will would be affected by this kind of argument. This is actually a good determinist argument, sort of, back in the day, but it has some holes in it. But I'm not of that position now, but I actually think he makes an interesting case and uses interesting examples. Insofar as we think that things should be explained and have reasons they happen and are determined, and we think these ways, that he does have interesting points. He says, people who are driven by the passions, such as the baby seeking the breast, the cruel boy who lashes out at others, the bully, who's like, I just like hurting people. Well, the person who likes hurting people apparently does not understand all of what's happening. If they did, they would stop because they would realize they will have comeuppance in the cosmos and morality in their hearts, etc., is the theory here. And the drunk who sees more to drink and so just reaches out, grabs another one. I have been not drinking anything during the pandemic. There have been times in my life where I've been thinking to myself, and I go and I crack a beer, and I think I didn't really need another beer. Why did I just go through the motions? Here, of course, and I'm not drinking, any beer, and haven't been for a little while. It was never that bad, but again, that is a little bad, isn't it? Again, you start going into the motions of, how do I have another drink right here? Well, yes, because again, you're not paying attention and being a bit ignorant as to, and unself-aware. All these people, Spinoza says, the baby seeking the boob, where we all come from, the cruel boy, the bully beating up others, and the drunk who drinks another drink, all feel they are free because they do not understand all the forces that determine their actions. This is Spinoza's argument. That's always a decent argument for a lot more insight. Are we completely determined clock beings? And again, Spinoza has a mixed, strange opinion we are, but then all is one with just waves. So we're a wave clock, all right. I'm thinking of in the 1980s, actually, and my dad had one of these. It's like executives and others had these things that were like, it's kind of blue, if you remember, like aqua water, fake water. I know these are still kind of popular in East Asia, and I see them kind of in Chinatown, etc. And then there's like it's like slow oil wave, blue stained oil, like olive oil, and it kind of rocks in their stuff. And it was very common for people to kind of have those things. It's like, it's very zen to be in the 80s and have a fake ocean, while you're like screaming at people about statistics, in spreadsheets, etc. If you remember what I'm talking about, yes, we're that is kind of a weird sort of deterministic wave clock that would be sitting on your corporate desk, you know what I mean, and all of that. So just because there is no free will does not mean that human beings have no degree of control over their actions, though. Notice we have control to the degree, in a certain Pythagorean way also, that we've sort of, and it's kind of stoic also, insofar as we become the order of the cosmos, we are free, but it's actually the sort of Stoics, you're free to conform to the order of the cosmos, now you're free as the order. Well, that's great, you know what I mean? But that's not degrees of kind of freedom. That is freedom to conform to the only way it's going to be, of course, given this. Understanding the causes of one's behavior and situation with reasons gives one greater ability to act in various ways. If one has a greater exercise of reason, one will naturally be determined to take a better path than one that one may not have been aware of before. And I make this argument, and I like this argument a lot. And in fact, this I use, even though I'm not a hard determinist, it is good to keep actually sort of a pinball example of this in the back of your mind. So an individual who knows they are hungry is free to eat a sandwich rather than punch random people or burst into tears, but the past entirely determines, of course, whether the individual will choose to make a sandwich or not. In this sense, one gains freedom by reasoning clockwork-wise, and you sort of thus would have to be set up to be it's kind of Calvinistic. You'd be set up already to be a good reasoner and then get good reasoning, so you couldn't really get there fully intentionally, but once you're there, you are intentionally developing it as you were going to already. At least that would be from the perspective of God, and a bit more Islam, actually, inshallah. So, 2 is freedom, not freedom for the individual, but the individual conforming to nature. Scholars have noted that this is similar to Taoism of ancient China and Stoicism in Greece and Rome. In ways, both can be said, no, your freedom is you relax into the way things are and you don't really need to do anything differently. That is or isn't, depending on how we look at it and construe it, more freedom. I would look at it more chaotic. Well, now you have a free afternoon. You can patiently do different things. And I'm not a hard determinist, but as I like to say here, pretend that you are a pinball machine, and pretend that if Spinoza or the drunk is a pinball machine, and let's say that there are only 2 slots, it's like drink or don't drink, but then I go around the world, and I'm already determined, I guess, to do so, and then I add more slots to myself by adding more knowledge, so now I have a do Spinoza philosophy, and then do Descartes. So the thing is, the ball bounces around, and let's say I harden up the artery of go into the drink spot. Well, what that would do is make me a different determinate machine such that the ball always goes into a spot. But notice, if I create more behaviors, I appear and sort of am actually a more free clock. A clock that can strike 12 positions is freer than a clock that can strike 2. Yes? So in a certain sense, even though a clock that strikes 3 or 4 positions is just as determined mechanically as a clock that can strike 16 positions, a clock that can strike 16 positions is actually freer in behavior, though entirely determined, as much as a clock that strikes 3 or 4. That is sort of what Spinoza is getting to. If we were going after range of behavior, you know what I mean? It does seem like if I learn more and more and more and more, I am a clock that will always hit more so on the correct answer with absolute determination, you see, if I have more options. If I only have 2 and those are both wrong, I will always be wrong. If I have 2 answers and 1 is right, I will be half right. But if I have 16 answers and I go around and the world is usually one of those 16, then I would most always, be in accord with kind of the cosmos, a la the Tao. This is again a lot like the Mutazilites of Islam. Einstein said that Spinoza had more influence on his views than any other philosopher. When asked if he believed in God, Einstein said, quote, "I believe in Spinoza's God," end quote, which means Einstein is a bit of a deist. There are, of course, we think of sometimes construe in America, in the good old USOA, we would say the founding fathers are sometimes deists, and you will hear this word. A deist is sort of somebody who does believe in science, a bit of rationalism, the world is kind of a living clock, and that's God, a bit Newton, a bit Spinoza here. And then, we're sort of going to church or not, and kind of you will see that sort of when people talk about kind of the founding fathers of the United States, they sort of suggest this about several people, and that's more or less true. Again, there was a real cast of characters, but at a time, of course, when some people were moving the United States to be hardcore Baptists and other things, again, fun on the weekends, you got lots of time, can't dance, you know what I mean? Got other 16 activities to do in the Baptist pinball machine of love, much love, again, etc. to everyone, with my jokes and silliness. Is that with all of this again, essentially you have something like deism, and then this means that sort of you're believing in science and more science as you're still believing and calling and committedly Christian, and then saying, but I think God's sort of whatever science is kind of right now, and all that, and tradition is somewhat being questioned. This is often, and again, you can see how that's a precedent decently in Spinoza. So, Einstein argued, actually, funny enough, I do say I am more, hey, there is chaos, there is plenty of order, it's all of that, and I actually have my thoughts on where order comes from and how anthropomorphic it is, of course, but I leave it all open to people's beliefs, and I don't pretend to tell people what is absolute throughout the cosmos, of course, but I do share the history of these positions. Einstein famously, and some chaos theorists would say wrongly, said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Einstein said that. What he means is that there's newer math coming up that's more chaotic than his stuff. That's like, well, chaos, chance. And he says, no. Spinoza's right. There is an objective, rational, like systematic order here. And of course, actually, whether you like it or not, what happened is actually more, we, along with Mandelbrot and computer monitors, we ended up finding out the systems of chaos, order, etc., actually sort of help us in ways such that now actually hard determinism like this is not as much in fashion. I have said before that actually now it's in fashion not to see things as entirely determinate order, but I have had actually people come against me, and I realize now, and through talking with students, actually the community of mathematicians and others don't exactly come down on the hard determinist or free chaos sides, even in talking about chaos theory and fractals and other fractal geometry. It isn't really clear. In fact, I think that would make sense. If you come up with equations, it's not clear that those are, or methods of chaotic activity. It's not clear if that's order or chaos, actually. If we're looking at either side of the coin is the easiest answer. And again, I don't pretend to know much of anything about the math. I just try to know the psychological framework by which people, and those by which people theorize. So from my opinion, it is that technically no amount of kicking cans actually gets us so much, in many ways in philosophy, out of the determinist chaos problem, even the latest of math. That is my opinion about mathematicians. Again, much love. And again, if you are of the opinion that's it, I know there's at least 3 camps of mathematicians, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend again or go through them. But again, technically Einstein says God doesn't play dice with the universe. I have a book called God Plays Dice with the Universe. You can get this book. I read that and other things in college when I was interested in chaos theory and what is that from a philosophical point of view, from books which are pop. Some are good, some are bad, but trying to get the average person to understand what does any of that mean. And actually, fractal geometry had a decent influence on me, more the shape of what that would mean in nature and the implications, of course, than necessarily the equations, because of course I am thinking the angles here and how people are construing the world. And as you can notice, it really is kind of like for Einstein, I often say, 2 different guys helped him out with the math afterwards because he saw the shape of how he wanted to see things first and foremost, with time being relative and not Newtonian. Funny enough, what that means is Newton did not believe in chaos and chance. Einstein believed that Newton was wrong and not relativistic enough about time and space and light. In a certain sense, light actually would be constant, wouldn't it? But then what you would have is other people come along, and actually Einstein thus wasn't enough. Think about the theory of relativity. It's Einstein, and in certain ways, chaos theory, at least plenty of them would say Einstein wasn't enough of a relativist about chance and order. Einstein thinks that the speed of light, may change depending on what, and certain things are time and space can be relative and non-Newtonian, but he actually doesn't think chance and order, are relative. And in certain ways, again, chaos theory could be construing it, I'll leave it at that, as actually order and chance are themselves relative, like time and space. But Einstein didn't go that far, because that's why he said God doesn't play dice with the universe, which is interesting. He thinks that time and space are relative, but they're set like that, proportionally, and they don't move around chaotically at all. They would have to move slowly to be so steady, but does anything stop moving or changing on any level? So, yes, let's see here. So, I have a few notes on here. We are getting, again, onward to the hour. And I have some notes, again, in which I actually have with the class before, stumbled into the first point or 2 or 3 and a bit of Spinoza's ethics. However, and you are free, again, to look those over. I have had many students get very frustrated. In fact, again, this is an early part of the class. from Descartes to Spinoza here already, and many people will actually have an easier time reading Descartes, but it's easy actually if this is your first philosophy class to come away saying, I'm not really enjoying philosophy because I can't figure out Spinoza at all. Do not worry if you cannot read Spinoza and make sense of it. Many try, but try a little. You know what I mean? Just give it a glance over because, I want you to read it over a little, but I caution you, of course, you could not only drive yourself nuts, you probably will just not make much of it, and that is me and others. It is hard, and he is talking in a different time, and he is not saying everything he wants to, and he's already going to get condemned in his life and after as a heretic, so he's going to try to be secretive. But Hegel, who we will get to, wrote in his History of Philosophy, one could not be a legitimate philosopher without being a Spinozist, I suppose in some way, because he very well knows there's others with counter positions. Hegel geared his system to overcome and synthesize all dueling points of view and thought that Spinoza's monism had overcome Descartes' dualism. One of the final stages in Hegel's conception of history of philosophy, and he seems to get this partly from Spinoza, is the recognition, and think about what I just said about chaos theory, that freedom and necessity are actually one and the same thing and two sides of the same coin. Deleuze, a French postmodernist who follows Hegel and then Heidegger and others, we will study, called Spinoza the prince of philosophers. Indeed, for many thinkers skeptical of exclusive dualist distinctions, Spinoza's opposition to the dualism of Descartes became one of the first glorious moments of European thought. I myself was quite inspired by Spinoza as an undergraduate, although not so much by the texts because they're hard to read. But oftentimes, in fact, it has been, and everybody's different. It was for me, though. You sometimes read in modern European philosophy, Descartes, maybe Hobbes. You're a little bit frustrated because it makes some sense, their arguments, but it actually is not often what you think. And then Spinoza comes along. His arguments don't make much sense at all, but his views are actually quite beautiful and interesting. So it's odd because you actually have, and again, maybe it's exactly opposite for you. Again, Zizek actually writes a great book saying, let's pick up some good things from Descartes and not just trash him, because most people trash Descartes. Descartes, sort of the story of Descartes, he puts out arguments people would like, many people, but he doesn't really do that great of a job putting together arguments, according to folks. Although he's easier to read than Spinoza, because Spinoza comes up with fantastic views that are quite beautiful and dazzling, and he wants to have a hard argument for them, but he has a mathematical word problem argument that honestly is trying to do something with geometry he may not be able to do that way. So, much happiness and much love. That is Spinoza. I am going to follow up with Leibniz and others here and get those out over the course of this weekend, and I will see you. And we can grind some lenses to see better, if I ever see you.